Mark D could not join us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Erica. Just Erica. Here I am.
JustErika has joined us, and we're going to be talking first about different types of AI as sort of a callback to our previous discussion that we were having about types of thinking and mastering thinking, going through the levels of self reflection and awareness. And I came across a little uh, link. It's kind of an infographic, which I'll show briefly here on the stream. So you should be able to see that, but not Erica. I'll move it like in the middle, maybe. And let's talk about the first type, which is the purely reactive AI. That's the chess computer, um, and also the Go computer. But something that's very specialized, only does one thing, but does it very well. And we've sort of kind of crossed the line in, say, the last 5 years from that type to this type 2 limited memory.
Well, just a second. Type 1, why do you think that was so sensational? Because I remember when the computer beat that guy at chess and it was like a really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Why
Mm-hmm.
do you think people are really enamored with that?
Well, it was that was always a goal of AI research, even back in the beginning. Is can it strategize and think ahead in the same way that a human does in order to be successful at chess and strategy in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you don't make a move that looks particularly good, uh, but you know that 3 moves ahead or 4 moves ahead, you're going to be able to get your opponent into a position that's unwinnable, right? So that was the first time that we saw that computer software running on computer hardware could make those kinds of calculations and decisions and uh, then beat a human and beat the best human, right? Kasparov was the world champion at the time. So we saw that, and then everybody sort of moved the goalposts, as always happens in AI research. Whenever you get to one of these, it seems to be like, well, that was just really clever programming, really good hardware. A lot of calculations happened, but there wasn't any intelligence there. It didn't actually know anything about chess. It only knew what the programmers knew, and it was able to run so many calculations so quickly that it was able to beat Kasparov. So,
But why did IBM create that?
for the publicity, no doubt,
Why did
right?
they choose chess? Because that's something they could easily program a computer to do?
No, it wasn't easy at all. I mean, it certainly wasn't a trivial uh, outcome for them, and I think they did it mainly as just a proof of concept. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that this can be done. Nowadays, you can run software on your own computer that could beat any human being, and then the goalposts got moved, as I said, to Go, because Go was a much more complex game. It has simpler rules, but the play field is larger. It's a 19 by 19 grid, and the possible arrangement of the black and the white stones in Go is way more complicated than the limited ways in which the chess pieces can move. So it took what, 30 years almost?
Really?
Yeah, between Kasparov and then beating Go. And then the interesting thing was not only that they beat Go in the terms of beating the best human at it, but then they built an AI that didn't know anything about Go, and that AI played itself a whole bunch. That was the Alpha Zero project, and the Alpha Zero project then eventually beat AlphaGo at its own game. So they took like the specialized knowledge that humans had out of the equation and said, let's just have the computer learn from nothing and develop the techniques and the skill to be better at Go than our best possible Go program that we've ever created. And they did that in, I believe, the span of a year, maybe 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty rapid advancement. You go from chess and then 20, 30 years, now we have Go champions. And now we're going to the types of games where you don't have total knowledge. So like StarCraft or other video games where you don't know exactly what the other player is doing at all times. And you're getting human-like or even superhuman level of performance. And so that takes us to that boundary layer of type 2, where you're putting something out into the world and you can't control all of the variables in the same way that you can on a Go board or on a chess, right? When you're
It's a big leap.
it is a big leap, and that, so that's why self-driving is such a difficult problem, because there's so many unexpected variables that can pop out. That bicyclist can come out of nowhere. Maybe the traffic cones have blocked a lane that was always open, so you can't just rely on knowing where the exit for this particular intersection is. All of these things have to be calculated and controlled in real time. And so that kind of feedback loop is this type 2 limited memory AI. And so Tesla, Waymo, a few others kind of have the beginnings of that, but nobody, I think, who's totally sane would just get into a car right now and say, I trust this AI to get me where I'm going with no problems, especially if it was, like a storm out.
But do you think the technology is there? It's just people are too afraid and they don't want to, introduce something like that just to be met with derision and backlash?
No, I think that the technology isn't quite there.
Oh.
I think Tesla is pushing it as far as they can. But, Elon Musk has made some claims about when full self-driving will be available. And, it's supposed to be this year. We're almost halfway through this year.
I hear that every year, it seems.
Right. So that's another classic joke in AI. It's like it's always 10 years away or 5 years away.
Always.
Same thing with nuclear fusion. That's always 30 years away and always has been. But we're kind of getting there. And the second type of this chatbots, these digital assistants, I think that's something that has been way overpromised for a long time. We've been expecting to be able to talk to our computers since 2001 came along, and we had HAL, right? Open the pod bay doors. And we're still not able to talk to a computer in any sort of natural manner, in the same way that we can have a conversation. And I can ask you, please open the door, and you don't have to have a lot of context. You just, okay, I know what to do. You have to have this really structured and formal way that you address your digital assistant if you do so, which I discourage for privacy reasons, but that's a whole nother story. And then, so let's go down here to the type 3, right, which is the theory of mind. Type 3 has the capacity to understand thoughts and emotions which affect human behavior. This type, which can comprehend feelings, motives, intentions, expectations, and can interact socially, has yet to be built, but would likely be the next class of intelligent machines, right? And so they give the example of C-3PO, R2-D2 from Star Wars, and Sonny the robot in the 2004 film I, Robot. Although that's based on an Asimov, and I would say that Asimovian, is that the right way? Asimovian?
Sure.
Sure. Asimovian robot would in fact be a full type 4 self-aware robot. There's a lot of stories that Asimov talks about, the robots kind of beginning to understand themselves in the zeroth law of robotics.
What do you mean? What's the zeroth law?
That you have to preserve humanity above all, like even above obeying humans. You have to protect humans, but then what's even more than protecting an individual human is protecting humanity. And that kind of self-awareness is built into the 3 laws, even without the zeroth law. So we have this huge gulf, right? Because we're in type 2, and we're trying to get to this type 4, but first we need to have this bridge of these sort of semi-intelligent robots that have some understanding of our own internal mental states. And that's something that even humans
Yeah,
struggle
we
with.
don't even know what we're feeling
Right, yeah.
sometimes.
Sometimes we ourselves don't even know what we're feeling or thinking, um, much less another human being. So to ask a human, you know, to interact and engage, you have to, you know, have these sort of understandings of what they're thinking, what they're trying to say, and do the interpreting. And now we're asking a computer to do all of that work. So we may be stuck in this type 2 limited memory for quite some time, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Before I think the illusion will be pretty easy to build, but in the long term, you'll find that it is just that, an illusion, not an actual implementation of this type 3 theory of mind sort of robotics.
Hmm. So, what kind of things would the type 3 be used for, and what kind of things would a type 4 be used for? I'm thinking type 3 be more for like elder care. That's the first thing that popped to mind. But why do we need fully self aware robots?
Well, that's a great question. Why do you need it? So the question that's a question of consciousness. I'm going to get rid of the pop up because I think we've seen enough of that. Um, why are we conscious and self-aware, right? Why did evolution bring us to this space where we ourselves have this whatever capacity to self-interrogate, to talk about our own thoughts and feelings, this metacognition? How is that an evolutionary advantageous creation? We know it is because as soon as we got it, we started creating tools and doing all these things, right? So it seems to be something about the way that we can model the universe around us, build up this understanding or this simulation inside our own heads of reality, and then using that to manipulate the external world, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where the benefit is, but of course that's also where the danger is, right? Because as soon as the AI gets to that point where it's like, all right, I'm building up my own understanding,
Mm-hmm.
I'm building up my own model, I'm able to change my own mind, I have a theory of my own cognition.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to be fully under our control anymore, right? It's going to be under its own control. That's kind of
So
the
it's going to have a
limitation.
thought that we didn't give it.
Right. And that's where you go into that type 4 self-awareness. But I think that as soon as you get the type 3 where it's able to make changes to itself, to do that sort of metacognition, you very quickly snowball into the type 4. And that would be the cutoff to the singularity, because then it's making such rapid progress in its own mental cognition and how it's thinking. If you could do 1,000 years of thinking in the span of a few minutes, what kind of decisions would you be making? I don't think they would be human level decisions
they
at
wouldn't.
that point. So, the idea that AI is controllable after that point, I don't think is true. AI will so quickly surpass us. It'll be sort of a small snow tumble, a few flakes that turn into a giant avalanche, and then the outcome is so unpredictable, which is part of why I wanted to start this podcast.
Like unpredictable bad, or just
unpredictable, right? So we don't know. There's so many outcomes. Nick Bostrom has a book, if you want to read deeply into this, called Superintelligence, where he talks about all the different types of superintelligence that could possibly develop. And most of them are not very human friendly. Most of them would, I think, look logically and coldly at what humans are doing and say, this is completely unacceptable. The way that you're acting is not even in accordance with your own stated goals. And so for your own protection or for my own convenience, I'm just going to, take over. I'm going to take control of all society and networks and power and do whatever it is that I want to do, right, as a super intelligent being. Like if God existed and came down to Earth, he'd probably want to make some changes. So if you create
Just a few.
just a few. So if you create a god from the machine, the Deus Ex Machina, right? If you create that, then you've sort of lost control already of
Definitely
of
lost
the
control.
outcome.
Yeah.
And that's just a natural byproduct of this whole progress, this whole systemic push towards control, right? So the interesting thing is that we are sort of locked into the course already.
Yeah.
There's no way that we cannot continue to develop computers and make them smarter and add more parameters to their AI.
And do you think, I just had this thought, like, this self-aware robot that's going to take over.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that maybe some people actually want that, because there's so much disarray and untrustworthiness in, humanity, human organizations. Maybe some people, I don't know if they even would know, but would want something like a god to be here on Earth,
right. Well,
taking care of things.
I mean, human beings seem to, if God doesn't exist, they will invent him, right? They will create a god.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting thing if you think about it, that the want for a higher power has been there all through history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's only now in these final unfolding of technology that we get to see the process by which it's going to happen.
Yeah. It's like Dark D said, like, this is our moment to make a god. I mean, not right now, but we might have the technology someday to make a god.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have a question. Why don't you have trust? We don't have trust for a lot of reasons, right? The first is, what would you trust from an a priori basis? Like, you just come to Earth, fly down in a spaceship, you don't know anything about humanity. Why would you trust anything that anyone says? Where would that system of trust even begin to be built, right? Because if you look around, most of the time what people are saying is more about the appearance or the symbols that they're using rather than the actual truth content.
You're sexy.
Well, thank you. I agree. So when we're examining all of these issues, AI, self-awareness, cognition, it's always good to start from the 0 point, which is zero trust, right? We don't even know what's going on in our own heads. We don't know what this podcast even is going to be when we begin it. In and of itself, it's sort of a yes, that's the safest thing to do. Do I enjoy my life? If my wife says it's okay.
It's okay.
Oh, thank you. Anyway, we're getting a little off track, but the point being that as
start with zero trust.
Yeah, you start with zero trust, right? You don't know for sure anything.
But people don't like to be in that predicament.
No, people hate it.
People want to trust.
They want to trust.
Innately want to trust other people.
Right, and so that's how things seem to be. Okay.
A little off topic.
A little off topic.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the point being that internet trolls are pretty much everywhere, and you should not trust them. I think this is a really good illustration of of trolling and how it can disrupt a conversation, right? Um,
And it's so stupid too.
it is, but it gets a reaction, and that's
It
why
does
it
get a
works,
reaction, yeah.
right? So, um, how do we know that anything is true, right? Where do your um, first points of reference come from? Well, they come from your society and your culture, which is kind of pushed down on you. And you were reading that book that you were telling me about, which I think is a really good example. So if you want to,
Which book?
the Anthropologist.
Oh, yeah. It
Yeah.
was really illuminating about just I don't even know how to describe it, but these other cultures that they were studying
Well, no, go
in New
back it up
Guinea.
and yeah, tell us all about the situation that they were in.
These anthropologists studying cultures in New Guinea. Um, a really fascinating book. Put the title of it in the notes later on. But it just really made me think about who we are as a society. And I know that sounds canned, but just the way these other people live that had never come into contact with Western cultures are so different and so much the same.
Yeah, we're all running on the same biology, right? We all have the same urges, the need for food, sex, shelter. Like all these things are natural human urges, but then they get this layer, which I've been talking about through all these episodes, of sort of memetic reprogramming or redirecting of these human animal drives, right? That we have. And there's so many different ways in which culture controls and channels and makes some things taboo and makes other things acceptable. It shows you what role you can play in society, what role you can't play in society, how you can act and how you can't act. And now we're seeing this memetic war actually being fought in its purest form out on the internet, right? Even in the comments of the chat, how it's being determined of what is appropriate to say, what is not appropriate to say, what jokes are allowed, what jokes are not allowed, right? All of those are value judgments. And so if you come from a point of like zero trust, you say, well, wait, we need to back up a minute and say, when did any of these ideas actually get in my head? Well, they came from culture, and the culture is sort of a ongoing experiment of human behavior and human programming. So all of us have been programmed in some way.
Yeah, and it was just interesting, like, these other people who, like I said, had no contact with Western culture, just their ways of thinking and their ways of, interpreting their reality was so different from what I think. And it made me realize that I think that because of my culture. And there's other ways to think about things.
Yeah. So there's always that step back that you can take and say, wait a minute, my value judgment or my thought was based on something that was previously put in my head. It didn't come from nowhere.
Exactly.
Or even if it did come from like the most basic animal primal part of my brain, it gets filtered through.
Yeah,
all
that
of
must
these.
be bad.
Right, it must be bad or it must be good.
Yeah.
Right? You do this behavior to appear virtuous. You do this behavior and you're an evil person. So we're kind of working through that, but at the same time, the allowed spectrum of what's possible is expanding enormously because of technology, because of the ability for anybody to pop up online and say anything, right?
Anything they want, yeah.
I want to go to that other link. There's a long essay by Charles Eisenstein, The Conspiracy Myth, which I thought was really good.
It was good.
Let's just pop that in the chat because it's a long read. You should read it when you have some time. So, what was your takeaway from that um, when you read it?
Well, a little long-winded,
Yeah.
but he's kind of saying, look, there's might be truth to conspiracy theories. There might not be truth, but maybe we should look at both sides with kind of unbiased opinions, which is impossible, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
But interesting the examples he pulls up, like Enron,
Mm-hmm.
like these conspiracy theories that were conspiracy theories until they weren't.
Right. Right. Well, conspiracy theory in and of itself is a super loaded term now,
Yeah.
right? If you want to dismiss something in the mainstream dialogue, right? If you were a politician and you wanted to discredit something, the first thing that you would say is, oh, that's a conspiracy theory.
Or fake news.
Or fake news, right? Those are almost exactly the same sort of signal that you're sending out, that whatever information is contained in that framework is wrong, right? And can be dismissed with prejudice, right?
Yeah, just like a broad
Mm-hmm.
dismissal.
A broad dismissal and can't ever be brought back up. It's already been proven false.
Yeah.
But yet we know, of course, that every day there are conspiracies. There are people who are using their power to enrich themselves in ways that, if they were widely known, would be condemned heavily, right? But yet, because of the ability to maintain some level of secrecy, some level of deniability, Enron's a really good example of that if you want to dig into how the disinformation occluded the information. Because the clues were there that Enron was bankrupt and was going to fall apart, right? If you were a forensic accountant, or you were able to have access to how they were running their business, it was clear they weren't going to make money. They were losing money like crazy, right? The Iran-Contra thing, there were rumors of that. There were people who knew that. There were investigative reporters who were talking about it, but there wasn't enough of a mass dissemination of that information to the point where it was considered true, and it could always be pushed back with an easy, that's a conspiracy theory, right? The main conspiracy theory is that the idea of conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA or the NSA as a system to immediately discredit any of their enemies, right?
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking, I wonder what the first conspiracy theory was that you could point out and say, that's the first conspiracy theory ever.
That's a good question. I mean, probably in our common modern American discourse, I think JFK dying was and all of the investigations that didn't really seem to pan out. What's the name of that? I think the Zapruder tape. And so there were these hints that maybe something weird had happened with JFK, right? The way he was killed. Maybe there was another person who shot him. The story that we heard was not the true story. And whether or not that's true is sort of irrelevant. The idea has stuck around. And more of these ideas are sticking around and having power simply because they're a negation of the primary narrative, right? The news narrative that you used to have a monolithic sort of media. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, right? Fox was later. First you only had 3, so there was even less. And all were owned by large companies with interests in being large companies and maintaining their profitability. And so they also had to engage with the government, right? So the government had some control over what went out over in the nightly news, right? You can publish this story, we'll give you this, but don't cover this because of national security or, for whatever reason. And I think that started to break down after Kennedy was killed, right? There
Because it was
was,
just too good of a thing to cover, or why?
well, what do you mean? It was too good of a thing.
Like, because you're saying before the government would say don't publish this
Mhm.
because of X, Y, and Z. But you're saying after JFK that kind of broke down,
No,
and
it
they
did.
had less control over media, or they had more control.
They had the same amount of control, but there was the beginning of sort of like a secondary market of ideas that was outside
Oh, I see what you
of
mean.
this main
Yeah.
narrative, right? So
Not mainstream.
yeah, before that you kind of sat down, the news told you what happened that day, and then you were informed, right? So you had the newspaper telling you, and you trusted the newspaper as being the fourth estate, sort of separate from government, but policing the government. And then more and more people have come to the conclusion that that's no longer a trustworthy system, right? There's too many times where we trusted the government about something, or we trusted the mainstream media narrative about something, and then, oh, actually, we were deceived.
Bigfoot is real.
Bigfoot is real. You hear, it's here, true. Bigfoot is real, right?
Yeah, I think people have been deceived too many times, or at least maybe not outright deceived, but led astray, or
Right.
lies of omission at least.
Yeah,
at very least.
At the very least. So, your Bigfoot is real is perfectly commented on in the X-Files by I Want to Believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a need, a sort of subconscious need that started to build up, and it was like, hey, there are things out there that we're not being told, that are being kept from us, that are probably very important.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative was always, if we're not telling you, if it's top secret, if it's classified, it's for your own protection, it's for your own good. We simply can't tell everyone this because there's some enemy out there who, if they knew what we know, they would use it against us.
Militarized Bigfoot.
Militarized Bigfoot, yeah. You put some rocket launchers on Bigfoot, you got a powerful soldier. So, that sort of dynamic has shifted to where the mainstream media is now as suspect as the conspiracy theories, right? There seems to be at least 40-50% of the population that's like, okay, we're on the blue church, and the other side is in the red religion, right? If you want to call it that, right?
Okay.
There's these two paths of thinking, that there's a main narrative that has been the American narrative of how things work and how capitalism is, and if you work hard, the American dream, blah, 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 right? And then there's the other one that's like, actually there's a shadow government, conspiracy theories, aliens, whatever you want to throw into that, the occult powers, reptiles are behind all the politicians. All of this is as prevalent as whatever your favorite mainstream news source is, right? They're sitting right there side by side. It used to be that the balance was almost 100% mainstream narrative, and now it's been pushed to 50-50, it seems like, right?
Really?
Yeah.
You think so?
I do. Just look at, like, the reaction to Donald Trump, right? He's sort of like the icebreaker of as we go through this, and everything behind him is sort of chaos. And it's up to us to be like, oh yeah, he's on the right course, or wait, this is absolutely insane. We're leaving a trail of destruction, 5 miles wide behind us. So it really depends on how you look at that particular narrative that he's built, right? Is he draining the swamp, or is he the swamp? So, right, that's where this conspiracy myth and the mainstream narrative have intersected.
With Trump.
Is with Trump, right. He sort of got elected on being the conspiracy theory candidate by saying, I'm going to drain the swamp, I'm going to tackle the deep state. Those are conspiracy theory motives, right? He doesn't trust Fox News even, right? unless they're saying good things about him. He certainly doesn't trust CNN, MSNBC. Those are fake news, right? And so if you listen to them, you're being deceived. That's a conspiracy theory. Now, whether or not it's true, it doesn't matter. Enough people believe it, and that's how that balance has now been so dramatically shifted. From we all get our same news source, we all sort of understand what's happening in the world, to, some people think that there are reptiles, there's, a pedophile ring in Hollywood. Like, all of these crazy ideas have entered the mainstream discourse and are considered just as valid in some circles as, whatever your favorite actual, I don't want to say actual, but your previously vetted source has been, right? So who should you trust? Some guy named Charles Eisenstein on the internet? Or should you be reading bbc.co.uk, Al Jazeera? Who is not propaganda now, right? Who is not suspect? Who is actually telling you the truth? And we got on the first cast that we did, we got like a set of sources. Like, oh, these sources are definitely, for sure, the ones that I would rely on. And the question is why? Why those sources? Where are they building their trust? And how do you know that, in fact, they're informing you and not creating a narrative that's beneficial?
Yeah, and maybe they're just telling you stuff you want to hear,
right,
or that you already agree with.
Right, which is always the confirmation bias. Yeah. So we're in this zone now where the media has created such vicious hype cycles about things that it's disrupted society all around the world.
Yeah.
And it's sort of culminated with this COVID thing, which now sort of seems to not be nearly as bad as they told us it would be. But of course, they told us that it wouldn't be that bad if we followed directions, right? So there's like this cognitive dissonance, right? They told us it'd be bad, but we acted. It wasn't as bad, but we're still supposed to believe that it would have been bad. So now we're acting on like faith almost, right? That somebody somewhere
That we were saved.
Yeah, that we were saved. Like somebody somewhere did the right thing, made the right decision, and that's why we had the outcome that we had, when in fact it may not have mattered what we did, right? Sweden didn't really lock down and hasn't had the, like a giant outbreak where everybody's dead.
That's what you think.
That's what we think.
You've been to
right?
Sweden?
No, I have not. So who knows?
Question everything.
Question everything.
Never be sure about anything in your life, and that's a great way to live.
Yeah, it's a pretty good start.
No, it's not. I have a question.
We have a question?
Yeah.
What is it?
How do you keep it in check? Who or how?
Well, you have this sort of conversation, right, about what sort of things you're believing in, what sort of informational biases have come into your zone, and what do you want to do about them? Do you want to keep them, or do you want to reject them?
I think part of it is like, well, yes, this is a problem. All these places are biased. We can't really trust anyone. We all agree, or at least some people say, yes, this is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So how would we go about fixing it?
Mm-hmm.
Would we elect some sort of group or something to, checks and balances on it?
Right.
Or could you?
Well, at one time I thought maybe you could fix this
or maybe
with AI.
the robot. Yeah, the robots can do
right.
it. Maybe
You could say to an AI, hey, go out there, ingest all of this information, process it through your many, many parameters, and then come back and tell me which of it is true. I don't know if you could build that. I think that sort of has to be built by itself. And that brings us back to losing control over the AI.
What do you mean it has to be built by itself?
It has to learn. You can't tell it what's true going in, right? Because that's your problem. You don't know
You can
what's
tell
true.
it how to investigate at least.
Well, how would you tell it to investigate? Where would you start with that?
Well, I have to think about it.
Put you on the spot a little bit, but it's a difficult problem. It's like, okay, only trust legitimate sources. Well, what's a legitimate source? Okay, well, now I have to tell you how to differentiate a legitimate source from a non-legitimate source.
Interview every person in the whole world.
Do you think you would get the truth if you did that? Like if you were able to like
I think
go
you
into
might not get the truth, but you would get, the flavor of humanity.
But is that what you're trying to get, or are you trying to get the truth?
I just wanted to interject.
Okay. So, we have the scientific method, and that's kind of been our gold standard, right? That I should be able to perform an experiment and have repeatability, and that works really well for kind of physical questions.
Yeah.
It works really well for building an airplane, right? We have trust that an airplane's going to fly, not because somebody told us that, but because we can, understand aerodynamics, we can understand how lift works, and we can repeat these things, right? You can say, all right, if I do this and I move it through the air in this way, it'll create enough lift and it'll actually fly. And lo and behold, there are things flying through the air every day. So we say, okay, well then all of those premises that you went in when you're talking about aerodynamics and lift and drag and how an airplane should be constructed, those are in fact true because airplanes do fly. If we were incorrect about our assumptions on airplanes and drag and lift and all that stuff, airplanes would crash all the time, right?
Correct.
So that's a way, but it doesn't map very well when we start to get into the more human biases, the more human programming, the sociological systems, right?
Yeah, like the theories of relativity and these solid principles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even those not everyone believes in or will take
Sure.
as fact, like
Right.
the flat earthers.
Yeah, there was that guy who killed himself, firing himself up in a rocket to prove that the Earth was flat. So that's kind of a strange
Poor man.
dichotomy or a strange breakdown in thinking. He believed in science enough to understand how to build a rocket and to do that, but not enough to safely do it. And he didn't prove his premise that the Earth was flat in any way, right? So he sort of had a misunderstanding.
Did his followers see the light and then were like, oh, he didn't do it, let's change our minds? Or are they like more stolidly and staunchly still flat earthers?
Well, I mean, as you know from religion, there are certain biases and certain ideas that get generated that are so sticky that even in the face of really powerful evidence against them, people will still believe. And in fact, they'll believe even more vehemently,
Yes.
more committedly, right?
Because you're just persecuting them.
Right, because you're just persecuting them. If you're saying that
you
they're
give
wrong,
evidence, yeah.
then you must be an agent of the devil or whatever, negative influence in the world that they're fighting against.
Yes.
So if you attack their belief system, they have an automatic sort of immune system. And that's the most powerful memetic systems will do that, will program people to reject other memetic systems, which is where we're getting our problems from, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't have multiple beliefs without the cognitive dissonance that causes.
Yes, there is still value in it.
Mm-hmm.
Starkey says.
Yeah, so the value is in exploring, right? What people have wanted to believe and what systems they have come up with to perpetuate those beliefs throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Monotheism as an idea was invented somewhere in the Middle East and has self-perpetuated itself down through history. It's morphed into multiple different, fragmented religions.
Mm-hmm.
But the basic tenet that there is an all-powerful God who is, perfectly good and perfectly kind and exists and is, watching and knowledgeable of everything, that was such a powerful, sticky idea in people's heads that it massively altered the course of history.
Yep.
And then a guy in the desert said, hey, I actually am that guy here in the flesh to give you additional information. And that was an even more sticky idea, right? That there was now not just this nebulous guy in the sky, there was an actual physical incarnation,
Mm-hmm.
a bridge, if you will, between God and humanity. And that was an even more powerful idea.
Yeah.
So these memetic systems, once they become entrenched in your thinking, will drive all your behavior and give you a powerful impulse to reject anything that challenges them, right? And even more so, they will encourage the believers to give this belief to non-believers in the understanding that it's such a superior belief
Mm-hmm.
that whatever they believe should be eradicated and replaced with this new belief.
Yep.
So that's where we get back to zero trust, right? Because
Kind of a long-winded answer.
yeah. But that's really the thinking that I have on it, is that these systems are so powerful and everywhere, right? So prevalent in all aspects of our society that we don't see them, right? You don't see the forest for the trees, to use a cliche. But it's a good one because we don't see our internal biases until we start doing this breakdown of what do we actually believe. What is a conspiracy theory versus what is the gospel versus what is the truth versus what is taboo.
Yeah.
And
You're already pre-programmed.
Right, you're already pre-programmed by the time you're about 5. And as soon as you have linguistics, the language that you have determines the thoughts that you can have, right? You can't think a thought unless you have the words to express it.
Mm.
And that's been a powerful force throughout history, right? That's why books get banned. That's why, there's the idea of heresy, of actually, if you say that, if you give voice to a particular belief system which is in opposition to the primary,
Mm-hmm.
to the mainstream, then that's, enough reason for us to wipe it out, right? If we have to kill you, if we have to kill the host to cure the disease, that's okay, because it's better for the entire society, because we're all trying to run on the same software and the
Mm-hmm.
same memetics. But now all of that's broken down, right? You can't kill somebody for their beliefs anymore, supposedly. At least that's what we're told. But yet we have right now in America this ideological war of what people should be doing in response to injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And
How far they should go.
how far they should go and what's justified given the historical context.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you even argue that? Where do you even begin to say, okay, this is how people should act, or this is where the truth of the matter lies, right? And it's probably not one single clear narrative that anybody's come up with, right? It's a more complicated thing, and if you zoom out, you'll see that there is systemic injustice in the entire thing, right?
Mm.
Which then leads you to say, well, if that's the case, if the system is really that sick, we should probably wipe it out and try and start over, which has 2 problems.
Mm.
1, how do you wipe out the dominant system without massive violence? 2, what better system can you implement, right? What better system is out there that you could try?
I will not like rise to power and misuse it too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, how many revolutions have happened, and then uh, the the party that came to power through the revolution is as destructive, or inhumane, or more so than the one that they replaced.
Sad fact of human nature.
So that's the context in which we're operating, is that we don't know the truth. The truth is so far away, so through so many layers of misinformation, that all we can do is kind of swim around in the shit and see if we can find any sort of solid purchase, right? They do this to rats as a test, a stress test.
Oh.
They throw them into water, right? And somewhere in this water is a clear place that they could stand on, right? And the rat will swim around and eventually find this hidden platform that it can stand on. And I think that's where we are. There is truth out there. It is findable. There are systems by which you can find truth, science being the primary among them. But you have to be so deliberate and so careful in the application of it, because scientists are humans and they bring all of their biases to their work, right?
It depends on who's paying them too to
and
do the research.
It depends on who's paying them. They always need to get paid, right? Science has to be funded by someone. And so how often has a scientific report been massaged to be acceptable to the people who are funding that research, or even acceptable in the mind of the scientist, right? Going back to your book on anthropology, right? The anthropologists always bring their own biases when they're studying. They're not aliens with no preconceived notion of what a human should be. They themselves have been brought up in a certain type of society with certain expectations of what behavior is. And so when we're engaging with these methods, we can't just stop at being like, well, I'm a scientist and I was doing my research. You have to say, well, okay, is that valid science? Is that methodology in any way biased? What were you trying to prove and why?
So tiring.
It is
it's
tiring.
So tiring.
It's
all these
like
trying to find the truth is so vexing and tiring that people kind of just believe what's put in front of them now,
or whatever, confirmation bias they have.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're doing this podcast, right? So we want people to reevaluate what their thoughts were, but we can't give them new ideas and new things. We can't replace the damage that we do during this podcast, right?
So much work.
All we can do is sort of kind of kick the spurs, so to speak, and get the horse moving. But we don't really have control over where it goes. We're just a voice out in the darkness saying, hey, wait a minute, take some time to think these things over. Take some time to investigate all of the different possibilities that are out there, and then come to your own conclusions. But be advised, those conclusions that you're going to come to, you're probably going to have to start over again, right? And go back to the beginning and then question all of the steps that you took to arrive at that conclusion.
I think people are even more overwhelmed nowadays because I was just thinking about this earlier, scrolling through Wikipedia about all these different articles, you realize how much you don't know. I was just thinking like maybe 100 or 200 years ago, you only knew a certain set of things, and that was fine and dandy, and there really wasn't much else to learn.
Yeah.
And now there's just so much on the internet all the time, 24/7.
Yeah.
And to parse out the truth from each single thing, that's tough.
Yeah. Who wrote that? Why did they post it? were they trolling? Because trolling in its finest art is indistinguishable from truth, right?
Why do they call it trolling?
That's a good question. I don't really know.
Hmm.
Some people say it's because like the troll under the bridge, right? You know, who asked the questions of the billy goats
Yeah.
who are trying to cross. Other people say it's like trolling, like a fisherman trolls, like, you know, he puts his
Oh, that
line
makes
out
more
and
sense.
he's
Yeah.
trying to reel some
Yeah.
people in.
Yeah.
Both of those kind of make sense, and both of them probably miss the truth of it. So it's
Yeah.
yeah.
Context.
Mm-hmm. It's all the context.
And it's
How do we want to wrap this
I
up?
know, it's just it's there's a lot of things. There's so many things, and then what you even see and hear and think is not really there.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Like,
It
it's like you perceive your world differently from everyone else,
Mhm.
and it might not be the truth,
right. You
but you don't know.
Yeah, but you treat it kind of as if it is the truth, right? Here's how I feel, here's how I think, here's my conclusions, and you act on them.
I think you have to not go crazy.
You kind of have to not go crazy. I mean, we sort of had to make this leap that somebody would listen, somebody would join in the conversation if we started it. But what basis did we have for that? Not really any. Just our own biases and our own ego kind of driving us to do this. But yet, the fundamental value that we can bring is to kind of go through this conversation again and again of saying, hey, wait a minute, let's back up and let's think about these things. I know it's hard. I know it's tiring. I know it's an endless process. Philosophy's not really fun, right? People don't do philosophy for fun.
Yeah, people don't like to think about how they think.
They don't like to think about their preconceived notions. They don't like to think about the ways in which they are misled or wrong, or the mistakes that they've made in their thinking. They like to, blame it on somebody else or in some way minimize it. So it's not a fun process to go through this, but yet it's so necessary, especially now, especially in these times, right? So if you're still listening, we want to thank you very much for hanging out with us, for having the conversation with us, for trolling us.
Great fun.
I love the trolls.
Great fun.
They're my favorite. And we'll put a few more links in the chat from our script. But the magic of this is going through the process and having the conversation. And so, thank you, Erika, for joining me.
You're
could
welcome.
not have done it without you. And we're going to see you next Sunday.
Toodaloo.
Toodaloo. Have a good one.